What's up, good peoples? We just recorded an episode taking a skeptical look at the effectiveness of prayer. And I've been wanting to do this episode for a while. What we did not know was between the time I pitched it and when we recorded this, one of us would actually be diagnosed with cancer. And so we're going to get into the discussion about prayer, but then at some point, it's going to take a turn for the more personal. And it actually ends up being one of my favorite episodes because this sort of just shows what happens when the rubber meets the road with unbelief. And it doesn't get more rubber meeting the road than something like this. So, yeah, rock with us in the comments and let's get into it. Welcome back to another episode of Ichabod. Figured it was time for us to discuss a topic that's been burning on my heart. We're going to discussing things with God, aka prayer. I need the praying hands emoji to pop up on the screen right now. We'll get that going with the special effects afterwards. But I'm very curious. I'm trying to think back to when I deconverted, and how, think about a relationship with someone. And if I were to tell you someone that you had a relationship with, you can no longer talk to that person. You can no longer call or text or hear from. You can't even write a letter to this person. Relationships are based on communication. But when I deconverted, I had long since stopped communicating with God via prayer. The me shooting prayers up to God and me feeling like I was receiving anything in terms of a message from God. But before we dive into deconversion, I'm just curious. Think back to your Christian life. Were you a prayer? Did you have quiet times? What did they call it? Did you go into your prayer closet? What did you believe the communication was like between you and God?
Should I start? I guess.
Sure.
Yeah. Growing up, prayer was a big part of my life. I would say, I don't want to get too much into all the details, but I think I could say for certain that, my Christian life was defined a lot by prayer. There was a thing when I was growing up in church, they always not only admonished you, but a lot of people would talk highly about, so-and-so was a prayer warrior, right? That's that was the label that, and, it was a sign of virtue, I guess, but it was a sign of faithfulness, but it was also a sign of it was like an attainable goal that, not only they facilitated through, early morning prayer meetings and things like that. But, I remember being in grade school, junior high, even high school, having these super long prayer meetings. You would, someone would sit in a room with a guitar and they would kind of play some music in the background. And then some people broke out in tongues. There was a few occasions sometimes, but these prayer meetings would go on for hours. I remember.
Wow. And you were there for that entire time?
I was in there for, there was
were you praying too?
As much as I could,
right.
As much as a teenager, adolescent could kind of, you run out of things to say, right? but yeah,
I guess that's where tongues comes in handy.
That's where yeah, exactly. So, So,
okay.
So that was, I would say if we're talking about what, I don't know if they're the fondest memories, but the most kind of vivid memories of prayer. It was those really late night prayer meetings that would go on for 2 hours, things like that.
And I'm just curious, last question before I pass the mic. When you were praying the kind of prayers that you could actually expect and know whether or not God answered them? Like, did you look for responses to the prayers in your life?
I think it all depended, but I think sometimes yes, but they tended to be more about if you had a friend or family member who was sick. It was more of those kinds of prayers. Yeah, you would hope to find good answers to them, right? Positive outcomes. But I think for the majority cases, for me at least, I don't know. I think a lot of it was more of it was like a purging kind of that happened. It was, I don't know. You're trying to, let out a lot of frustration maybe about your life, but also a lot about trying to, I don't know, be the best Christian in a way. And I know that that's not how they would put it, right? That's not how a lot of people would put it.
It was part of your religious experience.
Right.
That's part of the ritual.
It's part of the ritual, and then the fact that you felt sanctified through that process. So I think that was a lot of that.
Yeah. I know for me, even before I became a real Christian, like to the point where I cared about what I believed and how I lived, my grandmother scared the crap out of me when I was around 9 or 10. And she told me, she said, prayer is like feeding your spirit. And if you don't feed your spirit will die. And she told me that. And I remember ever since she said that to me, I prayed every single night since she told me, regardless of how I lived, I didn't care about, I didn't want my spirit to starve and die. So I prayed every single night. And then when I became more spiritual, when I became a Christian, the prayers took on a more relational aspect. Yeah. Before then, it was more ritual. Jay, what was it like for you? I guess earliest, since me and Al kind of just went there with it, how early on did prayer set into your life? Did it take? And at what point did it be, if it was never, like for me, it went from ritual to relationship, or so I thought. Was there a shift like that, or was it always relationship for you? Was it always ritual for you? How did it go?
I grew up in a religious home, so I guess you would say it was a Christian home, and yeah, it was a part of life. It was a part of what it meant to be a decent human being. What is it? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
Right. So that's where everything began. So believing. Part of the reason why I'm in Jehovah's Witness protection is because I recognize the way I was raised. You hadn't begun to become a decent human being until you believed in God. At least that was just foundational. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So, yeah, I mean, I guess they probably had a notion of common grace that wouldn't have been articulated the way it was in reform circles. But you were largely just a fool if you didn't believe in God. And that relates to prayer in that, prayer was the life of a person who believes in God. A person who believes in God is prayerful, at least the way I was raised. So it was necessary. You wake up, and I was raised in this way. The first thing you do when you wake up is you give God thanks. You pray when you wake up. The last thing you do before you go to bed, the literal last thing you do is you would get on your knees and you would pray. And this would often be a time to reflect on your day. And even though, Christians who are gospel centered, they speak about moralism and say that don't fall in those pits. You couldn't help when you got on your knees but reflect on your day, the things you did, the things you said. And you might ask God for forgiveness for something you had done that wasn't right, something that you might give God thanks for something that went well, et cetera, et cetera. But every day, every night, those were the bookends. At least those 2 times you would try to say,
at least,
yeah,
right.
and that was sort of like the minimalistic expectation from childhood. And then as I got older, it got more involved, and I there were times that I would go on fast and stuff and decide I was gonna.
I didn't even think about fasts
more. But praying and fasting kind of went together, and in the tradition that I grew up in, fasting was a regular part of the week. I believe my dad would fast on Tuesdays and Fridays, and that meant like he wouldn't eat anything until dinner, pretty much on those 2 days a week, every week, and he did that my entire childhood. Like it was twice a week. He would go the whole week, the whole day, and without eating anything. And then once a year, he would go do a more extended fast that was more or less 50 days long, and it was the same thing. Just one meal
50
a day.
50 days?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was pretty common. He would do that, and I did it. I would do that too. And
Really?
I think you were allowed water. Yeah, you were allowed water, but that was it.
Wow.
You just do that, and
Yeah.
so fasting and prayer were a regular part of, and they would do what they called shut-ins. I remember going to a shut-in with my grandmother. You go in there, you might go on a Friday and you come out, I guess it would be like a Saturday night or something like that. And you wouldn't have eaten all day. And, you would go, the shut-in was a fasting and prayer event. You would sing songs, fast and pray, nothing else.
So let me ask you, Jay Witt, was it ritual or relational? And by relational, not just this is how I connect with my dad who's fasting and my grandmother, but was it vertical, relational, or was it more ritual?
I don't care to answer that. That's a bifurcation fallacy as far as I'm concerned.
Really?
The way I was raised, it was both. I mean, both and,
Okay.
Yeah, it was part of the way you live, but it was supposed to be relational, of course. So,
But I mean, when you think back, can you sense there being something relational in your being? Like,
I mean, it's all BS now, but like,
no, I'm asking you to back and put yourself back then.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's all BS, literally. But in terms of sincerity, yeah. I mean, I wasn't starving myself for the fun of it. I was sincere, I would imagine. But of course, the Christian, they won't give me that. So I don't know if he's even worthy of, of discussion. I mean, if you could, I could talk how sincere I was, but the Christian's gonna be like, yeah, you didn't do enough.
Well, but they're not in the they're flies on the wall, so we don't have to worry about them too much. Yeah. But okay. All good.
You don't have to worry. I am always worried about the Christians.
Which is why you're in witness protection.
Yeah. The eyes of the Christian roam to and fro throughout all of the earth, beholding the good and the evil. Yes.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Like I said, for me, it was ritual until I became a what I believe I was a real Christian, and it became relational at that point. One more thing on looking back. Because prayer is supposed to be conversational, like I got to the point where actually I never was the type. Once it became real for me, I was never the type to be down on my knees praying. I took it so relationally that mine was more of a as I go kind of praying. So almost like the pray without ceasing. Like I just had this acknowledgement that my thoughts were always bare before God. And so I just thought with God in mind, such that my thoughts were always prayer-like. It was just an ongoing, unending conversation. But I never hit my knees to have it, because in my mind, it never stopped and needed to restart. Could you guys relate to any of that?
Not me so much. Well, I think what you're describing is a little bit, it has some carryover with meditation practices, because they, if you talk to a Buddhist, they would say that meditation is not you just being quiet and alone. It's actually how you initiate that and implement that actually throughout the day. So it's funny how you kind of you interpreted prayer kind of in a similar way in that way. But for me, no, I think no, to me, I think the ritual was a big part of my understanding or my approach to it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, overall. So. Yeah.
I'm reflecting off of your reflection, like hearing the way that you responded to what I shared. Like, whoa, that wasn't common for you. Now I got to think back about why it was so common for me. But here's one of the things I think about now. In my deconversion, I think that might be one of the biggest reliefs, is because it was so. Because if God is omnipresent, and God is eternal, and God, my thoughts are bare before Him, I'm never alone. I'm never not praying. I'm never not in communion. And so in deconversion, it's almost like, I'm thinking like it almost might be like, I feel like it must be what a husband or wife must feel when their spouse goes away for a weekend. Like you get the bed to yourself for a change and you kind of get to stretch out. Like deconverting was almost like I get to stretch out my mind for a change and not have to be thinking that someone else is spying on my thoughts. Whatever internal monologue is going on is a monologue now and not a he's hearing this. So anyway, that's part of my deconversion that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, is getting my inner world back to myself. Jay, can you relate to any of that? Kind of just the ongoingness of this, the internal world of prayer?
No, I had very specific schedule. I mean, obviously, if things came up in a day, I would address them in prayer. But 1 Kings 18 talked about Elijah casting himself onto the ground, putting his face between his knees, and praying. And I remember when I studied that, I began to do that. And also, just when Christ was in the Gethsemane, he was on, he got on his knee. It was a pretty regular. I felt like that was supposed to be instructive when you read the Bible, that you see all of these incidences of holy men praying and they would prostrate themselves. So I had time that was definitely set aside for that. Now, I would do other things like, of course I might utter something, but I felt like it had something to do with humility, where I needed to bow like my knee to, not just as a figure of speech, but literally get down on the ground, put my head between my knees, and prostrate myself in prayer. Also, I for me, it was a way for concentration. So I was very, very, I would be in the dark often. I just wanted to be somewhere where I could seriously concentrate and focus only on and I kept the ledger. At one point toward the end, I kept a book. So if I told somebody I was going to pray for them, I did. I would write down what they talked about, and I would put it in my book. And when I would pray, I wouldn't freestyle. I would start off addressing all of those things, having quoted some passage of scripture regarding prayer from Paul. Pray that it would increase in wisdom and understanding and the knowledge of Christ and so forth. I would quote the scriptures, and then I would go right into praying for very specific people and the requests that I had written in my book. So it was very regimented. It was part of, and I don't know if that quite answers. It does answer your question. Yeah, it does, because I didn't free will it. I definitely had a method to the madness.
Gotcha. One more question on that before I move on. If prayer is communication is two ways. Some Christians have this experience. Others think about it in a different way, but I'll just throw it out there to see. What was the two-way streetness of your prayer? Did you ever hear from God? Did God ever speak to you, and how did you believe God spoke to you, if He did?
It was for me. It was always coupled with scripture. So often I would read So a lot of the prayers that I would do would be offered up based on something that I was reading in the text.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to realize whatever truth or principle in real life, or gain some wisdom. Say, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally. So that was a regular thing. I would always be praying for more wisdom. Yeah, I remember that.
Okay. Al?
Yeah, I think in some ways that's hard to answer that question, because you have, I think similar to what Jay Witt just said, a lot of my prayers were about kind of that sanctifying process, and God giving me more, like wisdom, compassion, humility. Humility was a big part of that. I think what the God spoke to me thing, I always, I think, equated that to some kind of intuition that you would somehow feel, based on a desire that you would deem to be, in line with what God wants you to do, or godly desires and things like that. And I think that was kind of the mode in which I felt that God communicated to me, right? That's, that, and then over time that changed, because I think, as I became reformed and things like that, it took on a different meaning to me entirely. So the Lord, I think, spoke to me more and through the sacraments, as well as not so much what he would be teaching through the scripture and confessions and things like that, but prayer no longer became that. I think that mode of communication for me, in the top down type of communication. So I think that's where my views of prayer changed, and then I think I had a lot of impact on how I approached it, but and also how I critiqued a lot of evangelicalism in that process. So looking at the pietistic roots of how we view prayer and things like that. So that's kind of a short summary in like how my views of prayer evolved in that process.
Okay.
So
yeah, like Jay Witt, I had an experience early on where someone challenged me to be hearing more of God's voice. And I went searching the scriptures to see if I should be looking for a voice. And I came away with the impression from the scriptures, no one taught me this. I came away with an impression from the scriptures that I should be hearing God's voice in his word, in the Bible.
Right.
The Bible would be God's word speaking to me. Learn his word, you'll know his voice. So that's kind of how you'll know what voice in your head is yours and what voice in your head is God's. Is the voice in your head that's saying what it says in the word? That must be God's voice.
Right.
Without really doing the work to kind of like, wait, if I'm reading the Bible so much, that shapes the voice in my head. So it's still my voice. It's just my voice echoing what I'm reading in this text. But I gave it the credit for being God's word because I was reflecting when I was meditating on it. And so it's echoing in my mind.
I might, can I chime in there?
Sure.
Here?
Sure. Yeah.
So this has a lot to do with expectations. By the time I had matured to the point where I was about to leave the faith, before then I had matured to this, or I had arrived at a point where I had rationalized the whole giving of the text to be, in other words, the direct revelation is what you're talking about, would have been provisionary in a sense for those before the completed text had become. So the idea was, what's the rationale in giving a person a text with stipulations and laws and rules? And I mean, he's like, find out. Paul talks later about finding out what the will of God is, and it's like, well, how do you do that? Well, you will find it in the text. Well, that was in my understanding, the reason for giving a text to you was so that you had something concrete, and you wouldn't rely on that kind of supernaturalistic, provisionary, direct.
A voice would
revelation.
be redundant if he's already given his word.
Yeah, he's given the word for the purpose of directing you, and it requires you to do the work of minding it. You know, so. And I didn't say minding it. That is like digging up the truths that are in the text. That is.
Okay. So we're going to move closer to this idea of prayer and whether or not, I guess, the effectiveness of prayer. But before we critique it, let's try to put ourselves back in those old shoes. Can you think of a time that you saw what you believed was an answer to prayer? Because one of the things that keeps a lot of people still believing is they've seen God answer prayer. So how are they, even if they come to have issues with the scripture, they can't doubt or deny what they've seen, what they believe they've seen God do in their lives. And some people might think, well, the only reason why you could be where you are as an unbeliever, you haven't seen the things they've seen. You must not have seen God answer prayers. So I'm just curious, can you think of do you have any memories of answered prayer, or at least what you thought was answered prayer when you were a believer? Anything that stand out to you?
No. I have one, but it probably gave me away.
Oh,
I don't know if I can tell it. Well, I guess I can hint at it. Well, you guys, you tell me. It's going to be short. I'll make it short. Delete it if you think it's too revealing. But at some point I was working. Oh yeah, I'll keep it more vague. I was working in a church, in a capacity that that would need to be filled when I left. I was leaving this particular church, so I had begun to pray in the Bible studies and publicly, and saying that I needed a replacement when they knew I was leaving. And I remember praying. So it was not something that was done, as Peter said, in a corner. This wasn't done in a corner. Like I did it publicly. But I also prayed privately for this provision. And what do you know? I don't know whether it was a month and a half, 2 months, but there was literally like ram in the bush type situation where I happened to be somewhere and ran into a person perfectly suited and amenable to replacing me in the capacity that I was serving in. So to me, it was an obvious answer to the prayer because it was such a very specific kind of thing that I was doing, that I needed to be replaced and so forth. It was, what are the chances that I'm just going to run into now? If I could get into the specifics of it, I'm not going to, but it will give too much away perhaps. But it was it was definitely serendipitous, to say the least.
Al?
It's a little hard to answer that again. I don't know. I think prayer reflects a lot about, what our needs and wants and desires are. And I think we can mask it, even when you say, Lord, your will be done, things like that. But maybe part of that is the trouble with that is that when you read the psalmist, there is that very human element in which they're, I guess they're asking the Lord for their, protection and wisdom and, grace and conquering their enemies and things like that. So I think that's what makes prayer really complex in a sense. But I can remember when, I got into art, when I got into the art school that I wanted to go to, that felt like an answered prayer. I remember when my grandfather had cancer, and wasn't an answered prayer, but that was something I earnestly prayed for, right? And then I can remember, when other people I've known were sick and things like that. And thinking back on it now, actually, a lot of these prayers didn't go, in the manner in which we prayed for, right? They all succumbed to their sickness or their, so it's, now that I'm thinking about it again, it's like I'm not really counting. I wasn't really counting the Lord, like, the Lord answering what prayers or not, like it, because I think that's kind of interesting now. Now that I think about it. Is that kind of what I mean? Makes sense? I mean, it's kind of...
So basically you're praying, and whatever the outcome is, it's an answer to prayer.
It's
simply because it's God. Like, you can't really...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe in that sense, I wasn't the kind of Christian that, tallied up a lot of those things. Maybe some do. I don't know.
Okay.
Who knows?
We'll come back to that point in a few.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I have several. I'll just tell one that stands out to me. I think I feel like I told this story recently. Hopefully it wasn't on Ichabod. Maybe I did it on Facebook. I'm not sure. But I had given my life to God. I was, I don't think I started doing Christian rap yet, but I was basically distancing myself from my former, running the streets kind of life. And some of the guys in my neighborhood basically sought me out to just start picking on me. Like, they just came to my door. One of the guys who actually lived across the street from me was with a guy who was about 6 years older than us. And I don't even really know this guy. I just know that those two had been hanging out. They knock on my door, and the older guy says, talking about the guy who lived across the street from me, says, he told me you've been talking shit about me. I'm like, I don't even know your name. Like, I'm getting God involved in my life. I've never thought about you to be talking about you. And basically they're trying to get me to come out and fight one of them. The older guy wants me to fight the younger guy. The younger guy is, I don't know how, they're trying to get me in some nonsense. And then every other day they would just come by and knock on the door and just, try to get me in. And I'm like, I'm doing what you have been talking about, Jay Witt. I'm praying and fasting, and it's changing from ritual to relationship. And one day I came across a psalm. David prayed this prayer, and he said, my enemies have cast a net for me. And he prays that God would have his enemies fall into the net that they themselves had cast. I remember praying that prayer. I was 16, 17 years old. Like, and it was funny because the prayer starts off talking about they darken his doorstep. And I said, that's how I feel. Like, these guys are darkening my doorstep. Their presence cast a shadow. So I prayed that prayer. And about a week later, I'm sitting in the house, and I hear this huge commotion outside. And I was even too afraid to go to the door. I just went to the window and peeked out. And I saw about 100 people just slowly chasing a car down the street. And in the car was the older guy who was trying to start trouble with me. And outside the car was the younger guy and his father. And they're basically trying to jump in the car to fight the other guy that was on my porch. And there's a huge crowd of people just following, watching, cheering on this nonsense. And part of the psalm was that God turned them like against each other, like to confuse them, let them fall into the net that they had cast. And I remember looking out the window saying, like, God did it. Like, God specifically did what I prayed. This prayer, like, it was crazy. I've had several other experiences like that where it seemed the thing that I was praying about happened specifically the way that I prayed it. And I couldn't think of any other at the time. any other explanation, then God must have, intervened and changed the situation.
Yeah, it couldn't be that the kind of guys who will show up at a guy's doorstep challenging him to a fight might actually eventually end up challenging each other.
Right, right.
Like that's an impossibility.
The fact that they were lying on me, they could possibly even have lied on each other. That couldn't be the case.
Yeah. We got to rule that out. Yeah, that's an impossibility. Yeah, without prayer at least.
Exactly, exactly. And so, sort of like Al, like I don't know if nothing would have happened if I would have counted it as God didn't come through. But I definitely counted the hits though. Like God did that.
I mean, a lot of prayer is really making self-conscious calculations, right, about things and certain outcomes that could potentially happen in the future. There's a good chance. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder even to what degree sometimes Christians, like, it's very rare that you pray the kinds of prayers that can show God up as false.
Right.
Like, you won't pray if someone's, got cancer, you'll pray that God healed them of cancer, because we've seen cancer go into remission, and we've seen people, radiation and all that kinds of stuff. So praying that God heals someone of cancer, like, okay, you can't really, like, it's different than praying that God makes somebody's, somebody who lost a leg. Like, there's no way that's going to happen unless God does it.
Right.
Yeah, I used to have an argument. I used to always say, when I left the faith, that is, I said, prayers are just too modest. Like, the person loses their arm, and then you pray that the doctors have wisdom, like stitching them up. You don't pray that he grows his. But my problem with that modesty is the being that you're approaching is supposed to be omnipotent.
Right.
So what task is hard for an omnipotent God? There's no task that's hard. So the difference between him giving a person the ability to regrow an arm and him giving the doctor wisdom, there literally is. If you talk about a person with infinite power, how do you measure the difference between those outcomes?
Right.
There's no difference. I mean, if he can.
But it's about measuring. The measurement is, I need a prayer that's small enough that it can happen on its own, and I can give God credit for it. Because if it's too big of a prayer, it's not going to happen. And I'll never give God credit.
And that's the inherent unbelief there. And that's why I said the modesty is one thing, but the modesty points to the fact that they are somewhat as atheistic as I am, because there's a sense in which they know, like, don't tempt the Lord your God. Well, you're not tempting him if you don't think there's a different, like, if you actually appreciate his omnipotence, if you believe that he has infinite power, it's not unreasonable to ask him to do something miraculous. Why? Because the whole world was supposed to be created by a miracle. Like, it's not like miracles are, I mean, he sustains the world, according to Colossians, by the word of his power. So it's not as though it's, some people would say that you're tempting God to ask him to do something supernaturalistic in that situation. And that's the way they would find their way out of rationalizing their way away from asking for. But you're right. I think they're asking for things that fall within the realm of possibility on a subconscious level, perhaps. But if they really analyze it, they know, like, this could happen if I didn't pray for it.
Right.
So I guess we can interpret, when Jesus was tempted in the desert, right? It's the Bible's way of saying, you can't. They're going to make it a sin, basically, if you want to ask for the truly, miraculous, I guess, in a way.
Well, you said, you're referring to when Satan tells him to turn the stones into bread, and he says, "You should not tempt the Lord your God."
Exactly. Yeah.
And
So-
you know what? Some people probably have extrapolated that principle from texts like that, where it's like, okay, so but it does make you wonder, is that text in there to help you to, you know what I'm saying, Brady?
I've thought that several times, that there's certain passages in the Bible that are basically just there not to get you to ask the bold things, because the bold things would show up the falseness of the whole system. This is why this is why it's wicked to ask for a sign. This is why you don't tempt the Lord your God. This is, because doing that, it would show up the whole system.
But when you really reflect on what it means to be omnipotent, there is no task that is more or less hard.
Yeah.
If you're truly omnipotent.
Yeah.
And so if you're praying to an omnipotent God, you should be very liberal. I would imagine it's like okay, this is great. Jay-Z did an interview, and it's an ongoing argument online with people. Some people falling on one side or the other. And in the interview, he somehow casually mentioned the fact that when he goes home for the holidays, sometimes a cousin will ask for, I think he said like $4,000. Yeah, $4,800 to start a business or something. And he was like, I'm coming home to rest. I'm not coming home to do business, essentially. And he was like, that's not how it works. I don't just, and so the way this relates to the prayer thing is that, oh gosh, this is similar. It actually reminds me of when Jesus was healing, when he was about to heal the man. We've referred to this before, and the guy was like, look, just send your word, because I'm a centurion, or he was some sort of Roman officer, and he's like,
I know how authority works.
I know how it works. So there's almost like people were looking at this situation, and they were saying, people were looking at both sides of it. Some people saying, hey, like if you're a billionaire, you have $1.5 billion or whatever, what is $4,000 to you? Like, it's not really that, it's not a significant amount of money. So some people are offended by Jay-Z's disposition and saying, like, that's more indicative of your lack of a willingness to want to help, because it costs you almost nothing to get this person to 40. And then there are other people who are like, yo, I vibe with him. I don't want to go home when I'm relaxing and just be having to like make business transactions with all of my family members. But I think the principle we can draw out from that for this prayer thing is that at least the former position, that is, you're a billionaire. What's $4,800 to you? That's the prayer. It's like you're the prayer answering rendition of a billionaire. like it doesn't cost you any capital, really. Like in your own, your own currency. You get what I'm saying? In the currency of potency, you have omnipotency. So in that currency, it's not very costly for you to do these things that in another person's with another person's bank account might actually be a significant amount of money. So the $4,800, even though it's significant to most people, is relatively insignificant to Jay-Z. You understand what I'm saying? This seemed like a bit of an excursus. Yeah.
Wasn't part of Jay's thing too, though? Like, it doesn't just work like that. You don't just ask for $4,800 to start a business. Like, you don't have a business plan. You don't have there's more to it than just I give you money and you start something. As a businessman, I'm not just a billionaire. I'm a businessman, and you're not. It's not just, can I go start a business? You're not. You have to be able to talk business, and until you're able to do that, this isn't a real conversation. I'm not sure how much.
I'm getting little hints that where you fall on his understanding.
If where would any of that motivation be in a God to have stipulations on, like, you've got to be responsible with this answer to prayer that I wouldn't even answer this prayer.
I wouldn't want to make it.
You're going to be responsible first.
I wouldn't want to make it too wooden. Right. I'm just taking it for the one, for the person. Let's look at the other side where the person's like, yo, you're a billionaire.
Yeah.
Like, compare it to your billions of dollars. This ask is not much.
Right.
That's the part I'm extrapolating
Yeah.
and applying to this. Is if a person has potency on the level of omni, then there is really no thing that they can ask for that's more or less difficult. The scripture actually says there's nothing too hard for God.
Well, that's where the faith healers make their money, because they will pray the ridiculous stuff.
Right.
And they'll pray the ridiculous stuff, but then they'll also have charlatans and people who are part of their act to make it seem like the ridiculous stuff actually happens.
Yeah.
So they'll have people come up and people come up in wheelchairs, and stand up. They'll have.
Well, let's just think about this. In a planet that has, 8 to 10 billion people, if you just do the mathematics of it in terms of probability, occasionally something is going to happen that defies normal, odds. I mean, if we listen to the scientists, our very existence, abiogenesis, this sort of thing is not a thing that is highly probable in terms of it happens all of the time.
Right.
But if you have enough numbers, if you have enough years, so occasionally something will happen that will seem inexplicable and miraculous. And if you factor in the fact that many people are believers in some sort of faith, there is going to be an overlap between the two of those things. That a person will have asked the deity of some sort for a thing, and it will have come to pass, even though it's highly improbable that it could happen. It might just look like a miracle. And so I'm only saying that to say that it's not just the charlatan that's planted. I think that sometimes somebody is quote unquote healed and it's inexplicable. And just because that's how it works, that's how the math works. I mean, when you have this many billions of people on the planet, and then you have that many billions of believers, you're going to have some overlap there.
Right. Which is why you could find miracles in any religion.
Exactly.
Because the overlap is that, you're going to have that when you have those two congruent things.
And also, Jaywood, if you just take the pool in which you're talking about, the miraculous accounts, we can easily call into question, whether or not those things can be corroborated at all anyway. Then it even knocks the number down way lower, to it becoming truly rare and truly, in that sense, kind of special. But once again, that it could still happen because we don't know why it happens. So.
Correlation does not equal causality.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And rare things, as I'm sure we'll get around to eventually during this pod, rare things do occasionally happen, right?
Yeah.
Sure Al knows this all too well. Some things that are very, very improbable happen.
Yeah.
They can be so improbable that everybody you talk to say, well, it's highly unlikely this way. And then when they run the test, you come back and you're like, wow. It's the needle in the haystack, occasionally, there's a great story here, and I'm gonna let this go, but there's a great story. There was a little child, a baby that I was with at one point, and I had literally dropped the proverbial needle. It wasn't in a haystack, it was in an apartment, but I was getting ready to have the baby there, and I was so worried I couldn't find this needle. And if you ever know, little babies, they're always crawling around on the floor. And it was I vacuumed, I swept. No matter what I did, this needle didn't show up. When you vacuum, you'll hear the noise when it catches in the vacuum. Nothing happened. I have the baby over within a few hours. I was so nervous about it because babies can put things in their mouths. You can have a medical emergency. The baby comes over. And what do you know? Within minutes, the baby's crawling. The baby picks up the needle and brings the needle over to me and hands it to me. It's what are the chances? I had turned the whole room upside down looking for this thing. The baby was over there just crawl. I won't even say it was. I don't even think it was 5 or 10 minutes. Crawls over. Not only does the baby pick the needle up, but the baby had enough presence of mind to grab the needle and to hand it to me. It happens. Occasionally, rare things happen.
Yeah. Let's shift. I'm curious. Do either of you remember? So it's closer for me, so I will remember, but I don't know about either of you. 10 plus years now. Do either of you remember the last time you prayed?
I think it was at church because like you, Brady. I think in the last year or two of my Christian life, yeah, the private prayer, I think, was almost non-existent. So I think it was purely reserved for the last service I was in. I'm not going to count the ones in which, and I'll talk about this a little more later, but that one session where someone prayed for me recently. Right. So it's not. I'm not going to count that as a valid.
Okay. Do you remember what you prayed in your last prayer at that church?
No, I don't.
Because I could imagine if you were already on your way out the door in your heart, for you to pray in church, there had to be, well, maybe not had to be. I'm just wondering, was it anything significant or just, I'm just going to toss this one up?
No, yeah, I don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jay Witt, can you remember your last prayer?
I will save you guys a long-winded response. I do not remember it. Okay. I do remember around that time, just prayer itself. Like I said, I was doing all the arguing for why God shouldn't answer my prayers by that time. Okay. I had gotten that far with thinking about problems on a world scale that I started realizing, to me, it just didn't seem sensible. Like, it didn't even seem sensible to approach with the request. And that was happening before I stopped praying. I think it made my prayers more modest. The more I came into understanding
right.
history. Like, I had started reading a lot of history at the time and started just coming to grips with some of the horrible things that happened historically in Jim Crow, under Jim Crow, prior to Jim Crow, just the slave trade, not only slave trade here, the slave trade in Africa, the Holocaust. I delved into all of that stuff, and just by the time it was done, I was done with history and just looking at the current news and what is going on in the world now. I couldn't bring myself to think that anything I wanted to ask for was even remotely important. Even if it were just like really, really serious. I was like, just because so many people had experienced so much evil and so many horrible situations that I knew they were probably praying because they were just absolutely horrific. And they didn't get answers that I kind of saved God the trouble, so to speak.
Right.
And it was a gradual process. So like I found myself praying and just being like, well, I just wanted to like acknowledge God and thank him for who he was and stuff. But at the same time, it's like, I'm just like I feel like there's a biblical passage where they talk about that, where the person is just like, I'm just a worm basically, like, you couldn't possibly, yeah. So.
Yeah, I probably mentioned this before. My last prayer was on the beach, 2021. I was about halfway through writing Let There Be Gaslight, and I hadn't prayed outside of church like you. I was praying in church, but outside of that, hadn't prayed on my own maybe in a couple of years. So talking maybe since 2019, 2018. Wow. 2018, I think I was still praying, even though I was doubting a lot. Still praying, but close to 2019, stopped praying. 2020, no prayer on my own. 2021, I was on the beach, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, I kind of went out into the ocean. And I've talked about this before. Basically, can't swim. I'm standing in the ocean, 1 o'clock in the morning. Nobody else around, no lifeguards, no beach goers, just me. And I kind of just looked up and just sort of, I didn't say, God, if you're there. That sort of was who would I be talking to if there was no one there? So that was sort of an assumed if you're there. But I just said, like, aren't you going to do something? Aren't you going to stop me from writing this? Aren't you going to? And then I just asked, like, God I think I asked for a miracle. Like, I told God, like, you could Jonah me. You could send a whale right now. I'm in the ocean. I'm
tempting the Lord.
Yeah. Yes, I think I really was. Like, if it's too hard for you to strike me down on land, I'll make it easier for you. I'm going to step in the ocean. Like, now there's nothing, to hold you back. Like, get me. Prove you're real. Do something. Shine a light. Speak to me. Let me know you're there. I'll stop writing this book. I'll go back to believing. I'll stop living my sinful life. Do anything. And stood there for a couple minutes. Nothing.
Just silence.
Yeah. I went back to my beach chair and kept writing. And that was the last time. That was 2 years, over 2 years ago that I prayed that prayer. And I don't miss it. I mean, like, I'm thinking now, like, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
I always talk about one of the biggest surprises for me has been nothing's changed, not a single thing. In the intro to this, I talked about having a relationship with someone. You would think if you have a relationship with someone who you say, I can't live without you. I can't breathe without you. I can't. And the next thing you know, you're without that person and nothing changes. It's like, well, wait, then what was going on all that time? You weren't helping me breathe. I could have lived without you. That sort of was the impression that I got from years of no prayer and life still continuing to just move on.
I could see some people saying that, like the apologist saying that, oh, that's so silly that he would pray. He'd go out to the ocean and pray that, and just like, what does he expect? Who does he think he is that God has to like? But
Right.
the irony is, when you take that attitude to stop yourself from praying, then they say, well, who are you to decide that you're too small of a person for God? You know what I mean? So, it flips on its head. It goes the opposite direction. Yeah. It's like, who are you to think that you can decide what's important to God and stuff? So they'll try to encourage you to pray with that.
Right.
So it's just very interesting that,
I think it's, when I talk to one person of, who's still a Christian, and, whenever you talk about, because I think prayer has, I briefly mentioned that kind of intuitive aspect to it. Well, I didn't really mention in reference to prayer, but I think, but I think that's true, and I think it also speaks for the kind of certainty that people can have as a Christian when they talk about their relationship to God or what they're convinced or believed in. But I think some of that is also drawn from their prayer life in a way. So I just remember, if Jay Wood is right that some people are going to look at your experience and think like, oh, it's so silly, or, that's not gonna, it doesn't convince me in any way. But if you kind of show them the mirror in some ways, or even just point out the fact that, that there's nothing unique about these experiences at all, and you would probably see them get very defensive. And in regards to this one friend of mine, he got very defensive. His response was, I know that this is the one true God. I know that this is not, you're not going to convince me that this is all, made up or mythological, and me just, So I think there's a very strong play happening there. And I think being unshackled from that is, I think, everybody gets there somehow if they deconvert, but
Yeah.
I think you're right about the intuitive nature of prayer, and like it's intuitive for people, even if you're not a believer, to almost wish, kind of almost in a prayer like way, for things when it's something that's outside of the grasp of something you can make happen, to wish that there was somebody who could make it happen. And I think that impulse, that intuition, is part of the reason they have to work so hard to get people to pray for things they know they can even accomplish. Like,
right.
So part of you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like part of the
exactly.
Christian enterprise is to make you to thoughtfully and prayerfully go forward with your, like, was it Ignatius who said that he would work like it all depended on his work, but pray like it all depended on God. Like they try to indoctrinate you to even pray about the things that you know you can make happen along, so that it isn't. I don't know. I'm not quite sure why it ends up being that way, but I think they have an aversion to you only praying for the things that you can't accomplish.
Well, because
Maybe
otherwise,
because
I was going to say, I think otherwise you begin to sense your independence. And so the constant need to pray fosters a sense of dependence upon God, but then also upon the system and upon the people that represent the system. So you get too big for your britches and start thinking you don't need to pray. Well, then, that's when you start finding out or sensing, maybe I don't need this thing after all.
Yeah. Right.
But what if now, this sounds like a conspiracy theory or something. I'm just throwing it out there for you guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What if, like, if you only think about it, so how many prayers are answered? What is the percentage of them that are answered where there's like, you could explain it totally naturalistically? So we're talking about two different things, right? We're saying the one are a set of things that we can make happen. I could reach out to Brady, but I need to prayerfully reach out to Brady so that when it happens, when it goes down, God gets the credit, right? But if I took that whole category outside of prayer and said, all right, just reach out. You don't need to pray about it because you know you can make that happen. Only pray for the things you can't. What would be like the batting average of the prayers if it was relegated to only stuff that you can't answer? You see? Are you getting what I'm saying? Like,
so you're kind of describing a process in which
it's a thought experiment. It's not really.
It's a thought experiment, but I guess you're trying to come up with a technical way of explaining how someone can define the parameters in which to get that confirmation bias. I guess more or less, right?
What do you think the batting average for the answered prayers would be if you took the whole category of stuff I can make happen, stuff I can call Brady or Al up to have happen, and that was just like, let's say just for this thought experiment, that would be prayers that you can't make. Right. They can only be for things that.
Right. So they want to seek that confirmation bias, so they're going to come up with the ways in which they can feel that and get that affirmation.
I'm basically proposing that if you did that, a lot of your prayers would not get answered.
Oh, I see.
Like if it was only for things that you can't, like that my man, I'm reaching, like I can't prayerfully go. Ignatius said work. Like if I was like, okay, I'm not going to pray for the things that me working can influence at all. I'm going to pray for the stuff that requires basically miraculous intervention only.
Right. Yeah.
If that were the case, it's just a question. Like, how many of those prayers do you think will be answered? What do you think, Brady?
Well, no, I mean, I think.
I mean, it would be zero, near zero.
Well, not necessarily zero, because, like we said, there are things that are outside the realm of what's normal.
Probability.
Those things still happen, so it wouldn't be zero, but at the same time, it probably would be a lot less. I think the praying for everything, it pads the numbers a bit. so that God looks much more successful, or much more active. But that's why I said it goes back to dependency, because all the things that you could do on your own versus all the things that God doesn't do when you pray, because the things that you need God to do and he doesn't do those things. Not only, I guess, would you see how independent you could be, you would see how unreliable God is. And so you got these two different sides to the same coin. We need you to feel dependent, so pray for everything. In him you live and move and have your being, so pray for everything. But then on the other side, don't just pray for the miraculous stuff, because that would show how undependable God is.
I mean, Al said nothing would happen, but if I was a betting man, I would go with Al on that. Like, I think if you took out the stuff that I could make a phone call and that could have contributed to it,
Yeah.
and they talk about God ordaining the ends and the means. That's another way they pat. Oh, this is great, Brady. That phrase, padding the numbers. That's a great way to speak of these phrases that they use, because they'll be like, God ordains the ends and the means. That's another way of saying, when I get on the phone and I'm like, Brady, look out, I can give that credit to God, because he ordained like the means that he's gonna do it by. Yeah,
Well,
it's an interesting thing.
There's another way of padding the numbers. Al talked about this a little while ago. Thy will be done. So you have Jesus, who you would think, well, that's the greatest prayer in the history of prayer. Jesus prays a prayer that doesn't really get answered, or does it? Father, take this cup from my lips. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. And if Jesus has to say that, how much less you and me, or how much more you and me, right? To have to say, okay, here's what I want, God, but nevertheless. Because on one hand, you have this invitation to pray. Your Heavenly Father knows what you have need of even before you ask it. But in all things, through prayer and supplication, come pray. Anything you ask in my name, it will be done for you. So pray. Some things, though, only happen through prayer and fasting, but still pray. But then, just in case what you pray for doesn't happen, even Jesus had to pray, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. So no matter what the answer to your prayer is, whether God moves the mountain or not, even if God doesn't do it, he still answered the prayer. The answer was just no. Right? What I say, God always answers prayer. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no, and sometimes it's wait, but it's always an answer. But if that's the case, once again, the numbers are padded so that he could never fail. The system never fails. The house always wins.
But most people probably don't operate that way, right? I mean, that's always the challenge in which pastors and preachers have to tell their constituents, right? It's thy will be done. It's that. But I think, a lot of people, they're really, there is a selfish gain element to it that I think a lot of people aren't willing to recognize. And I think given we put, that statistic that Jay was talking about to the test, that could, potentially tip how people, perceive and think about this and reflect on it. So, yeah, I don't know if that made any sense, what I just said, but, that's actually an interesting thing to think about, right? There is the message that Christians are receptive to, or no, you know what? No, there are ideas and concepts that they assume that their leaders and pastors are always trying to get to correct and to think about and to challenge, But then there are all the ones who kind of feed into that confirmation, or they feed into, what the constituents want to hear too as well. So it's complicated, but yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, Brady, but you're right. It's kind of, thy will be done becomes this kind of like, well, you can't put it to the test anyway. It could be a no.
Well, history is the greatest litmus test for God's will in some sense.
Sure, right.
Even recent history, right? Because some people will be like, there's what you call Christian liberty, so that, you know, there's a lot of freedom in Christianity. I mean, a lot of believers
Yeah.
would say it that way, that you have a lot of freedom. He'll say very explicitly, you can't, you know, you can't take another man's wife or something, but then that means you can take a wife from all kinds of places. He might say, oh, they have to be a believer, right? But he's not going to tell you which specific wife to take. So you have freedom, you have liberty. But when you actually end up getting married, you can look back on it and say, you get what I'm saying? Like you say, history will show you, well, obviously that's God's will because that's what happened, you know, whether or not that's the perfect match for me or not.
Right.
In his, I guess his foreordaining or decretive will, that was the wife I was going to have, you know? So if you wait around long enough, you basically will discover his will on any number of things, right?
But that just turns, that's an interesting thought, Jay Witt. It turns history into something that we really can't escape anyway, but it just, I guess it provides a name for it that may be unearned. Because there is a sense in which, you know, we don't know all the determining factors that produces the outcomes of situations.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever happens, we can't prove that it wasn't fated to happen. We can't prove that we actually had choice. We just know that's what happened. And we don't know why. We don't know all the determining factors. But then to introduce a God and say, oh, well, it must have been his will. Even the things that, you know, like you said, Jay, you look in the text and you might think, oh, that's not his will. He doesn't want this to happen or that, but it happens. And so now you end up saying, okay, well, I guess that must have been his will. Then you start creating all these different categories about God's permissive will versus decree will and all these different things.
Well, you have to.
Yeah.
If he's sovereign, you got to come up with something, right?
Also, what's kind of interesting is actually there are people, statisticians and mathematicians who actually do the work to actually come up with the probabilities of how certain things come about, right? Just to take Jay Witt's example, right, about you know, finding the right musician or something. I think I remember hearing a you know, explanation about, you know, this idea that you live in, let's say, a city like New York, and you run into somebody you hadn't seen in 20 years, and you know, you can literally declare that, oh, the heavens are in my favor. I'm seeing you again after 20 years for a good reason. When someone has actually done the work to actually say, well, actually, no, the probability is quite high in a city like New York, and because of, they've actually calculated the parameters and seeing like, well, yeah, it's like the odds that you actually might run into somebody that you hadn't seen in a while that maybe was very meaningful to you, you know, in that time, or you might, you know, this coincidental type of scenario is actually more likely than you think, you know. So there are lots of, you know, and you can look up studies like that. People have done the work to actually do some of this stuff. So it's
I'm
and
curious.
you don't want to become. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to shift gears. Go ahead.
No, shift gears. I don't want, because I know
Yeah.
we're running
Yeah.
against
Okay.
yeah.
I was tempted to ask, since deconversion, and Jay Witt, you kind of already went there, so maybe we can just rope this in. Has there been a time when you were tempted to pray? Jay Witt, you talked about, you know, sometimes being in situations where wishing you had an outside, you know, powerful outside source that you could turn to. And I think maybe we're even bred that way. I mean, we're raised with parents, you know, who are bigger and stronger and have more money and more wisdom and whatever, or more authority than us. And so we're used to having someone that we can go and ask for help when we need it, when we're at the end of our ability. And then I think God takes over that role once you become a believer. God's the parent. God's the one that you could always go and ask. But then when you deconvert, you can't avail yourself of this heavenly parent anymore. And so you get into situations in life where maybe you'll speak to somebody's future out there. Have you gotten in any situations in life? Oh, I guess I'll change the question and make it this way. You can either answer, have there been situations where you were tempted to pray since deconversion, or situations where you weren't tempted to pray, but you realized that had you been a believer, you probably would have prayed about that, but that wasn't there for you anymore? Can you think of any? Because I'm young in this, and I haven't encountered situations that were so life changing or life, altering. The biggest thing I've had is, running through the airport about to miss my plane. And, it did flash in my mind.
Keep on living. Keep on living.
Right. Yeah. It did flash in my mind, though, that, like, you used to pray about stuff like this. Maybe God could hold the plane, and maybe some kind. And I remember my instant reaction to that thought was, yeah, but pray to who? Like, I wasn't even trying to be rude to Bible God. I just was like, pray to who? Like, I don't think there's anyone there. And that was the end of that. I still made the plane, but I didn't pray.
Yeah.
Another situation just came to mind, but I'll save it for now. Any situations where you were tempted to pray, or you weren't, but you recognize that had you been a believer, you most definitely would have prayed about that.
Well, I guess I'll just go. This is kind of partly for the audience because, Jay Witt and Brady have been aware, but in the last, since July, I've been diagnosed with a very rare cancer. I know that might sound weird that we're kind of introducing this in the middle of the episode, but it's partly because the prognosis is very good. Right? It's not as life-threatening as I thought, but it was very scary at first. I was diagnosed with a very rare cancer called olfactory neuroblastoma. 1 in 2.5 million people get it. When I originally went into the doctor, I just went in because I had this kind of weird kind of nasal drip happening for the last 2 years, and it was kind of chronic, but it was getting kind of worse over time. So, I eventually thought it was COVID related somehow, but went to see the doctor, and then they found a mass, and and even then I was kind of like, could be like something benign or polyp, but after they took the biopsy,
we got to tie that into the probability thing, because there was a whole discussion about the improbability that it would be malignant because of the number. What did you say? 2 point what million?
1 out of 2.5 million. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So given those numbers, I very confidently told Al, just write this off. Like, it would be, lightning striking twice in the same place. Like, it's not happening. Like, what's the chances, right?
Well, okay. So, and this still goes back to what you said, Jay Wood, about that rare things do in fact happen, right? So, let me give you some statistics about this cancer. Like, the majority of people who get it are between the ages of 50 and 70. I'm 40. And for people who do get it younger, it tends to be children. And it tends to be higher grade, more aggressive cancers. That also applies to the group between 50 and 70.
You're a unicorn.
I am, yes, exactly. So I am bizarrely, getting this. I probably got this when I was 38, and it's a low grade tumor. And my father, who's he's an anesthesiologist, he's in medicine, and he looked at me one day and he was just like, "You're weird." It's like he just like, who the heck gets olfactory neuroblastoma low grade at in their late 30s, right? So, and obviously this works against this idea of prayer, right? Because something really rare and kind of bad was handed to me. But for me, when I first got the diagnosis, right, the first 4 weeks was incredibly scary, because we didn't have all the test results, right? I didn't have the surgery yet to see what, the whole constitution was of this cancer. And we didn't know if it had spread, things like that. So, it was terrifying. It was life-changing. And I, thankfully had my partner and family to lean on, as well as some friends and, my colleagues. But would I have prayed normally? Now, did I feel the urge to pray? Like the question, no, I had no inclination at all.
Not even in those dark first 4 weeks without having the test and the scary time.
Yeah, no, not at all. I had no seeking about, is there really God out there? I, became thoroughly convinced by, my own due diligence and determining that the answer to those questions myself, right?
Albert, that's humility. That's the opposite. No, I'm serious. That's the opposite of narcissism, which is we didn't bring up narcissism during this episode, but I think that's an important element of prayer.
Talk about it.
It takes. Well, I don't want to interrupt his story too much,
but you did.
I'm curious how you want to tie it in. Yeah.
Narcissism is a huge part of the whole prayer thing, and I think true humility recognizes the fact that you are one human being on a planet of 10 billion people. And it not only recognizes that, but it places that in real time, in real history, and it functions as a ballast for expectations. It doesn't expect the norm to be what's normative to like, it doesn't expect the Red Sea to part for you because you're special and whatever else. It looks at the situation and says, hey, what has happened to many other people will very likely happen to me, and there's no reason for me to expect otherwise just because I'm the heir of Christ or whatever else. So there is a certain, I don't want to get too preachy and dogmatic about this, but there is a certain humility to recognizing your stats and the situation and just assessing it for what it is, and then saying, well, I'm going to get the treatments that are necessary, which I'm sure you're going to get to that too, Albert, but you're going to get to talking about that, and then just kind of move on and not assume that like you should be some huge exception. That's it. I'll say that and back up.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to speak to that too much or much at all, because I feel like I'm who can really assess oneself, right? Truly, in a way. So, but it's good to hear that. At least for me, I tend to be very. I don't know. I'm not someone who likes to talk about myself in general. I don't really. It took a long time for me to even say anything about this on social media, and I finally did recently, and I got a lot of support, and it was really good. But for me, those 4 weeks, when we didn't know what the whole picture looked like, that was a time for not only reflection, but it was acceptance. Like that was that was the hardest thing about the whole thing. And I can see how people can use prayer maybe as a way to get there, maybe, but maybe even as a way to distract themselves from because you believe in a God, and you believe that he can kind of maybe intercede and intervene for you. But for me, it was, do I wish I had that as an outlet? Probably not. I don't think it would be, there could be a weird kind of disconnect that you can have from kind of your present realities, but I guess a way to put it succinctly is that like there's really no comfort in putting your hopes in some kind of miraculous outcome to me anymore. Like I don't find any of that comforting at all. So
So I'm going to talk in a minute about some possible benefits of something like hope and prayer.
Yeah.
But I just think it's very interesting that you weren't moved to go that direction.
Yeah.
Like a tree that's planted by rivers of water, right? Brings forth fruit in its season.
Oh, yeah. That's so ironic you saying it that way. Yeah. That's so good.
But since you introduced it, Al, so you are what's the status of things right now? Just for anybody who's like kind of like they heard it now, they're worried, like, oh, what's happening?
Yeah. So when the day came that I got my PET scan results, it showed that there was no metastasis or even no local spread of the cancer. That was, so to speak, an answered prayer.
An answer to unspoken prayer?
An unspoken prayer. Yeah, exactly. So that
that's the prayers of someone else for you, right? The guy could be answering someone else's prayer.
That could be someone, an answer to someone else's prayer. But yeah, that was number one at the list, at the top of the list in terms of what was going to determine not only my treatment but what my survivability projections would be. So when that came out negative, I literally it was like a fist in the air. I was just so happy to hear that, and because of what science tells us, right, about what the scientific evaluation was of me. So, and then the second part was still a little bit. I was a little nervous about was the surgery, and the surgery was, obviously the surgeon had. The MRI, the CT scans he needed, but they really don't know what it's going to quite be like until they actually go in during and operate. So not to get too complicated, but he went in. Originally, he had told me that there was a possibility that they would have had to do a very complex thing where they would have had to taken out my entire septum as well as a chunk of my skull base. Now this cancer originates from the smell nerve, so it's olfactory, so it was on the left side here. And then as well as he had contemplated that maybe they would have had to take fascia from my leg as well. And
was that
doing
for
all
reconstruction?
That for reconstruction, they would have had to do what they call a pericranial flap. So they have to cut across here, pull the flap down, take skull from the front, as well as drill holes right here in order to repair the skull base as well as reconstruct the septum. So I went in kind of being freaked out about that, and they would have had to still run a biopsy on the entire tumor, and if any part of the biopsy came back as aggressive, then that would have altered my course of treatment as well. So, so I went in, long story short, and I woke up and my partner was like right there, right next to me the whole time. But she said, great news. It's not as bad as he thought. They didn't have to remove the whole septum. They just had to get some clear margins on the left side, and then they still had to take a chunk of the skull base, but like a sliver, so not like a big chunk. And they didn't have to do any crazy, pericranial flap or take, tissue from my leg, and
it's like a praise report.
It's
like right now the church will be going up right now, man. The church will be going up. Praise God, you know what I mean? He went in there, and due to our prayers, he came out. It was not as negative as we thought it was going to be.
Exactly. So so to speak, very good outcome on the surgery. Now they ran the biopsy, what came back was a little odd, right? So, if we're talking about statistical, right, how tiny I fit into, the larger pool of the population, the majority of the tumor was low grade, but there was like a minuscule amount of necrosis, which means that there is a potential high grade portion of it, very small. And normally, I would have, if everything was low grade, it was just going to be surgery and I was out the door. But because there was that small amount of necrosis, the surgeon, didn't make a recommendation, but he said that I'm going to leave the decision with you and your family and your partner about what to do, whether to pursue radiation treatment, because there's not enough evidence out there to really recommend what to do in my case. So we thought long and hard about it. We met with an oncologist, and then I, decided to do radiation. And right now, everybody, you guys are noticing I'm in a different room. I'm currently in Seattle, in my second week of radiation treatment. So, but the outcome is positive. The prognosis is very positive, and after this is done, my chance of recurrence is, down to single digits. So,
praise odds.
Yeah. Praise the odds. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Praise the odds. Exactly.
Praise odds. Yeah.
So, just
that
reflecting on,
decision you had to make, people would have been praying about that too, right? Remember you're saying because of how rare this cancer is, there aren't enough statistics for them to make a recommendation. So the physician had to leave the decision in your hands. Now, if you were a believer at that point, you would have prayerfully been trying to make your decision. You'd have been like, all right. Yeah. And then at some point or other, you would have settled in your mind that, you felt led, I'm assuming, right? That's the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I had still been the type of Christian before my Reform days, I would have definitely said, I think the Lord is telling me I should do radiation. Yeah, after hearing
or against.
No, I wouldn't have said against. Hell no.
You think you would have? Okay. Like, hell no. I'm getting a radiation.
I would have come out of that 1 hour long meeting with the oncologist, where the oncologist gave me all the best educated guesses and statistics that he could give me. And I would have probably said, the Lord is telling me I should get radiation. Yeah.
So the Lord would have just sided with science, basically.
Yeah, basically.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I'm thinking about all the people who, on the hyper charismatic side.
Right.
They, like I said, they do tend to do more Elijah type stuff, where they'll whet the sacrifice and make it harder for God, so that when he does it, it's more miraculous. Yeah. And they would have said, if the oncologist thinks I should do radiation, God told me he's going to heal me without that. And they would go the opposite way.
Right. Absolutely.
There are people who,
just like basically ruining your own life. You just basically ruin your own life. It's like, well, I'm ruining it sufficiently so that it got to be God.
Exactly.
It got to be.
It got to be God. Now, if they were the kind of charismatic who maybe was very, it's ridiculous. Yeah. If they were the kind of charismatic that if they were very diligent though, with maybe fasting and prayer, who made it like a very regular thing, then they actually might come out okay. You know what I mean? So, but then they would chalk it up to God anyway.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So you're saying because you think the fasting might actually affect the cancer?
Yes, the fasting would, in fact, at least in my, my armchair efforts to understand, fasting's, the benefits for health, as well as with cancer prevention and treatment. Yeah. So, Now another Christian might say, well, that's, God knows, he knows the benefits of fasting too. That's why he gave it to.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? It's interesting because I was looking up benefits of prayer and just what medical community has to say about it. And they've actually done studies,
Right.
recent studies where they tried to look at, does prayer actually change anything?
Right.
And they've done, double blind, studies and all these different
trials,
clinical trials. And, but they talk about meditation and prayer basically having some of the same psychological and possibly physical benefits as meditation, and even placebo treatments. And I just want to read this one paragraph, or part of this paragraph here. It says, clinically significant treatment gains have been observed with placebo in numerous disorders. Listen to this, including anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, tardive dyskinesia, ischemic heart disease, cardiac failure, Parkinson's disease, and even cancer, among a host of other conditions. And they talked about just what optimism, and I've said this for years. I think there's something that, and they compare prayer to that, and they say prayer kind of works similarly, where there's something about the rest that comes with meditation, the getting the heartbeat stable, even getting certain levels of chemicals in your your brain to release certain chemicals, and so that they rise in your system, that those things are physiological, and they end up producing results that we maybe have not yet learned to harness as a species. But things like meditation and prayer could cause you to focus on getting those things to happen in ways that, and even optimism can cause some of those things to actually shift what's happening in your body. And so, does prayer change things? Yes, but maybe just not in the way that we think.
All right.
Well, that's why God prescribed it. This reminds me of the woman I was talking to, Christian, and she was talking about how like God had given the Israelites circumcision because it was basically helped with health. And I was like, I didn't say it to her because I didn't want her to think I was making fun of her or anything. But I was like, he could have just not given them foreskin. It was like ridiculous.
Right, because basically what that does is it makes circumcision a quick fix.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. But
why does a perfect God need a quick fix in his creation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I do remember my grandmother, she used to cry sometimes when she would be praying. Mm-hmm. And that has to benefit. If you're bottled up and you're holding on to it and you can't let the tears out.
Yeah,
exactly.
But then you have
it's cathartic.
It's cathartic. Yeah.
Like people have therapies where they encourage people to like cry out or cry or to let it out.
Yeah.
And if you're that kind of person where the scripture says it was in Peter, casting all your cares upon him because he cares for you. Like if you actually believe that and you feel like you're talking to a person and you can let out the cry and you feel like this person is going to embrace you as you cry, that's got to have a positive psychological effect on you if you believe it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it can't work with it doesn't work with us three numbskulls. Because we can't bring ourselves to believe it,
Right. But I think so without prayer, we do, I think, need to find some other kind of way. If prayer is one of the closest ways that human beings have come to harnessing that part of physiology, and meditation is another, and even the whole idea of placebo effects, I think people like us who've left religion, we are leaving something that has been beneficial to humanity, just not in the way that humanity, the religious part of humanity, thinks. We need to find some other kind of way to, and this is why, Jay Witt, you and I talk about this often, I remain optimistic a lot about a lot of things, even when it pertains to, is there anything after this life? Like, I have no idea. I don't have any reason to think there is, but I also don't have any reason to think there's not. So I remain optimistic, though I don't have a codified creed of what that could possibly be. But I just think there's something about optimism. There's something about having focal points.
You're not a nihilist.
No, I don't think I could ever be a nihilist. But then, like we just said, you guys have been 10 years out of the faith. I haven't had the kinds of experiences aside from missing planes or almost missing planes or things like that. I've had things that have happened that made me think, oh man, I don't know how this is going to work out. But I remain optimistic. But I wonder how life, what will happen as more things happen in life, when I lose loved ones and things like that. What will I cling to?
Right.
I have, very many Christians who will turn to me and say, what are you going to cling to? I don't know. I'm not going to cling to anything false, but I don't know what I will cling to.
What did he say in Job? Yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. You remember that passage?
No.
Well, that's another way of saying just keep on living, brother.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah. Aside from prayer, though, one of the things that we also, I guess, have robbed ourselves of, and the deconverting person needs to be aware of this. Without the church, one of the things you rob yourself of is a prayer answering community. So talk about padding the numbers. It's not just thy will be done. It's not just pray about even the things you can do on your own so that God looks more successful. One of the ways the religious pad the numbers with prayer is you're part of a community that they've taken it upon themselves to be a prayer answering community. So if you're voicing your prayers in the community, and now the word begins to spread that you need a job, or you need a place to stay, or you don't know how you're going to get to this conference in Atlanta, or whatever it is, you're making your prayers known in a community, and everyone there is thinking about how God might want to use them to answer your prayer. And even if it doesn't happen within your community, you're part of a religious sect that just goes around looking to answer prayers. And someone could just get the impression that you look sad. God told me to come and cheer you up. Oh, how did you even know? I was praying for somebody to come and whatever it be, buy me lunch today. I was down on my last, I needed to do laundry and I didn't have money. I had to choose between laundry and lunch. And here you come buying me lunch.
Vulgar. Now you're just making it vulgar.
No, I'm sorry. These are the testimonies that people say.
Yeah, these are real.
These are vulgar examples.
No,
It's
these
like
are
my
real.
laundry.
These are real. These are real stories that people. I see this on Facebook all the time. I had to choose between.
Brother, you need to get off of Facebook.
I had to choose between doing my laundry and buying lunch, and you came and bought me lunch. That was an answer to prayer. Because how could you have known that? But if you're a part of that community that goes around looking to answer these kinds of prayers, even the unknown or unspoken ones,
so God
that's
answers
just a
that
benefit
prayer, but
of being a part of that community.
He turns away from the Holocaust. He answers that prayer, but he let the kids get shot in the head and fall into a ditch.
Right.
No,
Exactly.
you're amen in that. Like, yeah, that's my God. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just saying. But I think one of the takeaways is for the unbelievers, the atheist community, the skeptic community, like, how do we foster what was lost and not having that anymore? I think that's something for people like us to be aware of. There's a need to do that all the more now because we don't have that, that other thing that used to do that.
Mm-hmm. No, this is a very sobering look at life. It is a joy to look at life through the lens of just truth. It's so weird. They're like, because you think about, he says, your word is truth and so forth. But once we realize that's literally the opposite of what it is, right? And then you're looking at life and you're just like, wow, just like, I don't know. truth is comforting, man. Even when it's not all that comforting, it's just comforting to not be relying on the, like it ain't that bad. Come over here where the table is spread and the feast of the non-Lord is going on, man. Like,
go ahead,
Al. I think you're talking about cold comforts, right? In a way, like truth can be that cold comfort, and it does work but it may not work. In that, I mean, I think a lot of it is part of the delivery or how you express it within a context. But I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily, Jay Witt. But yeah, I
think it's comforting in that it. Well, if I get what you're saying, Jay Witt, because I want to know more what you meant by that term, cold comfort, because I haven't heard that before. But what I hear Jay Witt saying is basically, once you know that you don't have a God or have, religion, whatever, anymore, at least you know what not to look for.
Sure.
Your answers in.
Sure.
Is that sort of what you mean by cold comforts, or what did you mean by that?
Yeah.
What I mean by cold comfort, I mean, sort of, yes, but I think what I generally mean is that, when someone is dealing with something, particularly in a very emotional or existential moment, or they're dealing with a problem that really gets to their core. You can tell them something that is corresponds to reality, I guess, in a sense, but it may not necessarily be making that impact on them at that, in that moment, So that's kind of what I mean by cold comfort in a way, like, yeah, having, but there's not to say that I think I maybe that's also why a lot of people in Christianity, they can't really leave it because they don't really know how to find an alternative narrative that speaks to them in a way that comforts them. That, let's say, something that Jesus might say, that sounds so soothing to them, or they might read the Psalms or something like that. So, what it partly is, though, is the absence of an alternative aesthetic, I think, in a way. So when we talk about the cathartic experiences like Jay Witt's grandmother, went through, or things like that, it's, if you're entrenched in religion, that has been the food in which you've, partaked for many years. But how do you find something different, that, is comforting? And it's not to say those things do exist out there, but you just got to find them. But, so.
It just brings to mind the quote from George Clooney on Old Brother. Old brother, where art thou? He's like, consider the lilies of the goddamn field.
Yeah, exactly.
You remember that?
No.
Yeah.
That's amazing. It was just an amazing quote.
Jay Witt, I didn't give you a chance to answer.
No, I've said enough. I think leaving it at Al's, because I think Al pretty much, his situation is the rubber meets the road of everything that we're talking about. And just consider, it's real. Like, non-belief is just as real as some of you guys think that the belief is. Like, when all of the cards are on the table and this is your life, that says a lot about these propositions. I mean, a lot of it is just debates about propositions and arguments and formal arguments and informal arguments. But you can see how this is like the fleshing out of the ideas. Yeah. Like, literally.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. I think we can just leave it there then. I think maybe we could ask the audience, viewers, to be commenting. If you are a unbeliever, atheist, skeptic, deconverted believer, how long has it been since you've prayed? What is it like? Maybe you could help people by commenting. What is it like to live life without that as a fail-safe? The believer, always thinks, you have that ripcord that you can pull. I can just pray. What is it like to not have that ripcord to pull? Do you feel a sense of self-reliance? How has it been finding a community of people that meet one another's needs, sort of like the church used to do, if you don't have that anymore? Any other things we want them thinking about answering here in the chat?
No, I mean, one good example or thing they could throw down their number one answered prayer. Brady threw that at us during the pod. So for all of our former believers, I want all of you guys who are listening, every one of you guys who hear this, if you can get in there in the comment section to boost it for the algorithm, but also to generate some lively discussion. Name the one thing you were just so certain, like this was, the improbability prayer. Maybe that's what we'll call it for the sake of coining it. The improbability prayer, or the odds were against it.
This had to be God prayer.
This had to be God. Yeah, there you go. That's even better. This had to be God. Just throw that in there. I'm interested in seeing these.
Well, here's what I'd like to add to that. Let's add to that. Can you talk about the "this had to be God" prayer that was answered, and then now how you look back at that as a believer? Do you still say, "I still can't explain it," or can you explain it now without?
You mean as an unbeliever?
Supernatural? Yeah, as an unbeliever.
You mean as an unbeliever? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you explain it now without invoking the supernatural, whereas before you thought it had to be God? Let's drop those in the comments and see what we get.
And I'm sure that, I'm sure we're going to get people who, have dealt with, scary situations with, maybe a diagnosis or a loved one that they know who had to go through one. I'm sure there are stories we're going to hear from them, and how, how were you able to kind of go through that or accept, what you were dealing with and processing through all that? Because for me right now, I'm still processing all this myself, but for me, I think it's something that will take time, and I'm trying to, I'm not rushing it. So,
just remember Brady's imprecatory prayer he started off. He already put his chip in there. He already put it in there. He's like, all right, I prayed the imprecatory and I saw it happen on my street. I saw it literally. They were at my step.
Yeah. So, hey, thank you guys for your time and for sharing. Good stuff. And we'll be back on it next time.
All right.
All right. That
sounds good.